talking with State Senator Craig Wilcox. Senator, the Illinois Supreme Court and at the same time the Illinois Board of Elections kind of agreed on some legislation that passed during the spring session that dealt with elections and people having voter choice. This particular measure, this particular idea was criticized as being unconstitutional, and we have since found out through various court rulings that it is indeed unconstitutional. What is this legislation that was going to really impact the November elections?
It all started with what I would call a key indicator that the Illinois residents should look for. Anytime a bill surprises the General Assembly, comes out in the House, passes, is passed in the Senate the next day and signed by the governor within 48 hours with limited honest debate and probably zero public input, it likely has problems. In this case, a blatantly unconstitutional attempt to change the rules of an election cycle well past the midpoint of the election cycle. So that's the core of it. So blatantly unconstitutional that even the Dem-heavy Supreme Court wouldn't touch it. So the outcome of this Supreme Court decision, voters actually win for once in Illinois. They get choice. 14 districts are going to now have voter choice in November, and that's what the majority party was trying to eliminate. They were trying to make a blatant power grab. And this, from that same party that went to great lengths to prevent primary challenges to the sitting president, Joe Biden, and then, lo and behold, force him out and do their own elitist slating. The hypocrisy on this year was just unfathomable.
Since the Democrat Party in Illinois has such a stranglehold on the legislature with supermajorities in both chambers, why would they bother to tweak or to pass a law that would change the rules in the midst of a campaign when they're so far ahead?
Possible aspect that they were scared. They understood that their president was not who he was 4 years ago. I think there was some nervousness that they had Democrats in certain districts around the state that were, and I believe are, vulnerable, and they attempted this to protect them. Another theory on it could be that they attempted to pass this so that Republicans would argue for the case of slating, knowing that they ultimately were going to slate a presidential candidate who hadn't seen primary voters either. So, we're not allowed inside the Democrat strategy session. So unless one of them is up for talking, it's hard to tell. But either way, neither path nor what they did in any semblance represents empowering the citizens of Illinois to have a choice. But yet that's what they claim their party's about. But we can go through multiple examples that show their words never match their actions. In fact, they're almost always 180 degrees out.
And I have to ask to get your opinion on this because, a couple of years ago, Illinois went through a redistricting process where political boundaries are redrawn after a decennial census, every 10 years census. And some of the outside observers of Illinois' redistricting process said it was one of the worst, offensively worse, gerrymandered set of legislative districts. Again, where basically you have a majority party picking who's going to vote for whom.
This is the nature of Illinois, right? We had a governor campaign on wanting an independent map aspect. We had hundreds of thousands of citizens sign petitions, and this is why I was scared on this Supreme Court decision, because that Supreme Court overturned the obvious will of the people that by all rights had followed all the rules to force an independent map structure. So, yes, This mapping took a 55-45 state on overall population, maybe you could argue 60-40, but turned it into a massive supermajority map, both in the Illinois General Assembly and at the congressional level. So we don't have representative government in Illinois. We have an elite selected, and maybe they got a bit aggressive. Maybe that's why they're worried about some of these districts. Maybe they attempted too much, knowing how poorly run the state has been under the governor, and that the citizens are recognizing they are not better off in the last 3.5 years countrywide, nor better off over 8 years in Illinois specifically.
Do you see maybe a rewrite of this particular law, or maybe we find ourselves back in court once again?
Well, it's interesting, right? We call this a Supreme Court ruling. In essence, it was a non-ruling. 2 of the Supreme Court justices recused themselves. Makes you wonder, did they have relations with the lawyers fighting this? Were they once slated, as they both came out of Cook County, I believe? Were they once a benefactor of the slating? But in essence, it was a non-ruling which held the state's appeal judge decision, which does suspend this rule for this election cycle. So barring anything else, slating will not be allowed in future Illinois House and Illinois Senate races. That just means that we need to make sure candidates or people thinking about possibly running understand that, which means they need to be engaged starting next summer. And Illinois has a lengthy electoral cycle. I'm all for a discussion of shortening that whole cycle. There's been national articles written on the length of our presidential cycles. It seems to be nonstop. What does that do for democracy? Does it allow for truly vetting candidates? The long cycle forces that, right? Candidates can make mistakes. They can learn. They can grow. The citizen really, in theory, gets to know the potential candidates much better through the length of the cycle. But that means residents also can get apathetic to the nonstop campaigning that's required. Do I expect this bill to come back? I would think so, because if you truly are against slating, you don't do it just in the Illinois Senate and the Illinois House races. You talk about it at the local level, and arguably where Speaker Madigan had his biggest impact within Cook County. So the question is, did they do this purely to protect Democrat House members in this cycle? Or, as the governor said, is this really an ethics bill, and will we bring it back and make appropriate changes prior to future election cycles and do it constitutionally?
Senator Craig Wilcox, thanks very much. Enlightening and in detail, and I hope more people really understand what this whole issue is all about, because ultimately it impacts one of their most basic rights in our republic, and that is the right to vote.
Absolutely. And yes, anytime the voters of Illinois win by getting their rights and their choice back, it's something to be applauded.